just a moment. All right, we are live. Good to go.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I would like to call this study session of the University City Council to order on June 22nd at 5:30. Prior to turning the meeting over to City Manager Rose, does any member of council have any changes to the two agendas that we have before us? Hearing none, Mr. Rose.
Honorable Mayor and council members, the purpose for tonight's presentation is to respond to any questions that you have relative to the space needs for police, court, and the city attorneys. For the city prosecutor's office, and demonstrate the needs could be addressed by our existing facilities. Tonight does not commit the council to a decision regarding whether the needs will be addressed by existing facilities or whether they will be addressed by new construction. Is simply an assessment of what the space needs are. So with that, I would turn it over to Sinan. Anything that I missed? And if not, I'll turn it over to Amanda.
You haven't missed any, Mr. Rose. Yes, with your permission, Trevor's team is ready to present.
Amanda, you're up. You're muted.
She's muted. You're muted.
Unmute.
There you
Okay. Hi. Thank you for having us back. We are focusing in on this session. We've studied all the departments except for the fire department in this study. And today we're back to focus in on the police and courts portion of the study. I understand that there will be a follow-up session where we can look at the balance of facilities, but we'd like to look more detailed at police and courts for this session. And today I have with us Bob Schwartz, and he is the senior justice planner for HOK. He has over 35 years of experience designing justice facilities. He's an incredible asset to this planning process, and I'm pretty much going to turn this over to him. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And this worked before.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And let me start that. So we've been working with Trevor's not only on this study, but some assessment last year as well that led up to this study. But let's go into the concept options. Okay, next slide.
Here we go.
There we go. So we've been looking at two options. One looks at trying to put the police and the municipal court together within the annex building, similar to the previous study. And we've gone through in the past few months review and updating of that study to make sure that we've covered everything with both the police and the courts, and looked at how that program can fit within the annex building. And the second option says, what if we separate the police from the municipal court per the Ferguson Commission report recommendation? And for that study, we looked at the police basically staying in the annex building and the municipal court moving to the to reuse of the Trinity building. And let's move on.
I'm trying. There we go. Whoops. It jumped ahead. There we go.
Okay, so you could see on the column on the left in the dashed box, the annex building has approximately 38,000 square feet, and the Trinity building has 8,500 plus about 1,500 square feet in stacks. And those stacks are, it's like a infill metal structure that was kind of built into the building to hold books in the most efficient space possible. So it has much lower ceiling heights or floor to floor heights in there, so they could get another floor in. So, but what we're looking at as far as the program requirements for the police and the courts is really something closer to just over 40,000 square feet total. And that includes space for our courtroom. As you well are aware that the courts share the community center on an as needed basis for courts today, which has proven to be staffing wise not very efficient, as they have to set up and take down the court every time they want to hold proceedings, and set up clerks counters for that. Okay, can we move on to the next? So here you can see, as far as adjacencies, that the police and the courts do have an adjacency, and they have a high amount of public external interaction. And here you could see a summary of the two options. So option one, if you look at this diagram, it's almost like looking on a site plan, but they're stacked by level. So the bottom you can see for option one is the basement, level 00 for the what we're calling the annex building, level 00, which aligns with the basement of the city hall. Level 1 of the annex aligns again with level 1 of city hall and up through the building. And then you can see the Trinity building also in level 00. And we're going to review that in greater detail, and then we'll go through option 2. So we're starting at the bottom. So this area is impacted by the lowering of the floors above for the fire department of the basically 4 vehicle bays. And when they lowered those floors, it made it difficult to use the space below. In this particular scheme, where we need to keep half of the area with a lower floor so we can pull vehicles in for prisoner transfer. So that could be the vehicle sally port. And that will tie into, well, up on the upper floor, that will tie into holding. But we're revamping the weapons training area, the firing range that we would reuse. We don't want to ignore that asset. And then we will have the evidence areas and locker rooms for the police. Okay, let's go up to the what we're calling the ground floor for the annex. So we want to use this basically column-free space with high ceilings, not only for the vehicle sally port, because it's the only place we can pull in a vehicle, but also we're looking at raising the floor back up and putting the courtroom in there. And that would have good public access. It could tie directly into the municipal courts, and in turn that could directly link to a lobby. And we can, as we demonstrated previously, we can make this lobby disabled accessible, so it has good access. And we also would have, the clerk areas for the courts, the clerk areas for the police. And then we see the behind what would be the sally port, or the holding areas for the police, and some of the other Bureau Services support areas. Moving up through the floors, the next floor, again, would be primarily office floor. It would have both the Bureau of Investigations, so that whole division could be up there together in good relationships, and then the administrative areas for field operations for the police, which is basically the watch, command, patrol, roll call, training areas. And then we have a small piece on the third floor where we can put the police administration and have some more kind of support area for the police functions. So this all almost fits in the building. What we're still short some storage areas. I think there's about 1,500 square feet of storage, which we're showing could go into part of the ground floor of the Trinity building. Looking for a place for it. So it fills this building. It makes, there's some shared support areas, shared lobby for the court and the police that gives us a little bit of square footage savings. But even with that, it doesn't all fit within the same building between the annex. Okay, so we can move on to option 2. So again, option 2 is the one where we move the courts to the Trinity building. So we're still showing kind of the step floor on the ground floor of the annex. So we still have this kind of unassigned crawl space under that vehicle sally port area where they can pull in the vehicles. And we'll have, again, still have the firing range, still have evidence, and more of the lockers. We can move more of the training functions down to the area with the lockers. And then moving on up, this is the whole area to the north. The blue square basically is all the police. And that gives us the ability to have other functions in what we call the connector. I guess it was kind of a 70s era between the two buildings. And maybe we look at maybe that's what we might call a public service center, where you might have representatives of the different departments that need public access who could man that area so that people could get much of their daily business done at that point without having to go searching within City Hall. And also potential for some shared support areas for break areas and mail, printing, conferencing. And then as you look at the Trinity ground floor, what we're looking at doing there is actually kind of reversing the entry so that you would enter on the east side of the building, which would be towards parking. And we would have the ability to add an elevator and a stair to take care of public safety, fire access. And we're looking at how we can actually move the court offices and the clerk functions for the court into this level. We can have security screening and have, we could have some police storage or some other functions that you might deem a good relationship as far as being located on the front of that building on the ground floor. And as we move up, you can see we still have field operations and the Bureau of Investigations. And then what we're looking at in the Trinity building is that reading room on the second floor is just a really nice space that we don't think we should subdivide. It could be used, again, for the courts. It can be used for city council chambers. It has a couple of support rooms that can be used for, say, the yellow one might be a good conference room for the prosecutor to talk over cases prior to court proceedings, or the ante room might be a good location for city council to meet prior to or to recess to during meetings. And we would also add some ADA restrooms to that level to make it more accessible than your current situation. And then on the next level, we still have the police administration and some field operations on the top annex floor on the 3rd floor. And we'll be removing some of the stacks from the Trinity building. And actually that kind of helps us. It opens up the building and able to get a nicer lobby in, because it's a steel structure that was basically inserted into the building and can be removed just as easily to open up a nice lobby. So with that, I think we can open it up to questions about these, about the spaces and anything else you might have.
Amanda, can we go back from the shared screen to the full screen?
Yes, Mr. Hales, I saw your hand up.
All right, someone asked me to go
Sure.
back to a screen.
Okay.
Which
Mayor was
one?
kind of quiet. I think he asked to go back to the screen of all of us and stop sharing. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Stop sharing.
Mr. Hales.
Thank you. I had two quick questions on the accessibility upgrades. Are all of those additional staircases that are shown in both options?
Right. Right. We have 2 stairs adding to the annex building to basically meet exiting requirements. And I believe we're still trying to use that elevator. We might have to upgrade or replace the actual elevator, but the shaft at least. But for the Trinity building, we're adding an elevator and a stair as well. We feel we can continue using the west stair, but we'll probably have to redo the east stair in that building.
Okay. And my second question, you talked about, I think it's level 00 is the lobby and entry in option
Correct.
2. So basically the front entrance would be on the east side of the Trinity building as well.
Correct. We're looking at, say, that current west entrance and that west parking lot is being more of a staff or police parking area as opposed to public. Trying to get get our front entry really onto the east side.
And so the west entrance, existing entrance with the staircase on that building, is that something that you see being used or?
For the annex?
No, for the
For the Trinity building.
to the Trinity building, yes.
Well, I think it's really an exit. It's kind of halfway up and down between
Right.
the 2 floors, which means it's not accessible. I think it'll be very difficult to get a good stair. I mean, an elevator in there, because it would have to go, stop at the entrance at one level, and then, well, first off, we have to get into the building. I think there's some steps there. Whereas on the east side, we can make that right on grade and get some good accessible parking in.
Thank you.
Good questions. Mr. Clay.
Yes, thank you, Mayor Crow. And thank you for the presentation. This actually may be more of a question for the city manager. So we are reviewing these concepts for police and the courts today. What's the remainder? What are the steps in this process? I know we're not making any decisions tonight, but what are the steps in this process moving forward?
Yeah, as I see it moving forward, the next step will be a review of the remaining departments, public works, parks and recreation, administrative areas, as well as city manager's office and so forth. So we'll finish up hopefully the other functions on July the 13th is when we have it currently or tentatively scheduled. After that, I think there will need to be some decisions that are reached, at least as it relates to these are the space needs that have been identified, and if there is a consensus that we can move forward with these space, assuming that these are indeed going to be the space needs that we'll need to address. After that, I think we'll need to do an assessment of some very rough estimates on cost. What's the cost if we're addressing these space needs with the existing facilities versus what is the cost if we're addressing these space needs with new construction. And then I'll be seeking guidance from the Mayor and Council on how do you wish to proceed, because you will need to make that decision prior to us being able to move forward with design. So that's how I see the process evolving. Is that accurate, Sina? I don't want to make sure I'm not saying something that's incorrect.
Correct. The current options are concept plan options. And once a concept plan is recommended and selected, then there is a level that the consultant calls sketch plan. And so that is more into detail before a cost estimate is developed, as Mr. Rose described. In the cost estimate development with the sketch plan is the end of this this phase before the design starts.
Okay, thank you for that. So in looking at both options, a sense I got, I think it was stated more explicitly in option one, but I got this sense in option two. So the police moving into the annex, it seems like everything could fit with the exception option one of storage. That would definitely have to be offsite in option one. And it sounds like that might need to be the case in option two. Am I that correctly?
To some extent, yes. Well, we could probably fit it all in if we did not have that shared connector space with other departments.
Yeah, I think that we will look at it comes. Part of what will need to be decided is we were certainly exploring the potential of a one-stop shop option for this renovation if the council decides to go in that direction. And so what that enables us to do is to better serve. One is just our citizens for routine business, but just as importantly, the development community that would come in and want to have plans reviewed, and we could have all of the different departments that are involved in that process in one area. So it expedites the review process and makes that whole process easier. However, it certainly takes space to do that, and space that could otherwise be used for storage if need be by the police department.
So the impression I'm getting is that, yes, the police could fit, like they could technically fit, not unlike I could technically fit into my high school prom tuxedo, but it's going to be close. It's going to be close. Is that a fair analogy?
Well, not necessarily for the police. I think when we were looking at both the police function as well as the court and then the prosecuting office, all of that combined, yeah, it becomes more snug. But I think that what we had charged Trivers with is based upon all these needs, how do you make it work?
Okay, so it's kind of, this is what we got. How do we make it work with it? It was kind of, was really the charge and what you've come back with.
Right. Based upon the facilities that we currently have, how do we fit all of the, how do we address all of the needs for police, court, and city prosecutor's office within the existing facilities?
Okay. All right. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Smotherson.
Thank you, Mayor Crow. Mr. Rose, I don't remember the statement you just made. I don't ever remember this assessment being limited to just the facilities that we have. But besides, but that's okay. What I'd like to find out is, why are we looking at this again? Why are we looking at police? Why are we looking at court? We've already had a study that said you're gonna fit the police in the annex. Okay, we've already had that. So why are we going over that again? And the other question is, why aren't we being presented with the other aspect of, I mean, what we're going to be presented on July 13th? Why couldn't we have seen that first, opposed to why are we again looking at what you've already told us in a report earlier, putting the police in the annex? I'm not sure I understand what the purpose of that is.
Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Smotherson, if you recall, this project first started with a project that evaluated whether any particular operation could fit within the annex, because there was some question initially about whether, because the area had been, I will say loosely condemned, whether any operation could fit in there. It was decided in a different report that indeed operations could fit there, and that would include the police department as well. And it gave you some very rough estimates about, you know, what, based upon their existing needs at that time, you know, how that might fit within the annex. This study is a little different in the sense that it really focuses on what are the needs of the police department 5, 10, 15 years into the future. So what are the space needs, not just for police, but for courts, for the city prosecutor, for public works, for parks and recreation, and so forth. And so that was kind of a large elephant to try and wrap our arms around. So it was decided, instead of bringing all of that information, which we initially did and received a lot of questions regarding that, it was decided, let's separate it. Let's look at it in two parts, dealing with how this project started in the first place, which was what public safety, and then bringing back to you the remainder of the needs, which I will, you know, place up under the umbrella of administration. So it was just a process. We thought that this would be the best way of tackling, which is a very large and very complicated matter.
Right, but we haven't done that. You stated that we were looking at this to see what would fit in the annex. We haven't done that.
Well, what
we've only done is we've done a report on putting the police back into the annex, and now we're doing another report showing us the police back in the annex.
But maybe
there's nothing we've seen that opens the door, that opens the possibilities of anything else being in the annex.
Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Smothers, and maybe I wasn't clear. This report focuses on the needs of the organization, the space needs of the organization. What you're seeing first is, police, the courts, and the city prosecutor. What will come on the 13th are the additional needs for the organization. Now, the most complicated of the project would be, how do you address those needs within your existing facilities? So we wanted to demonstrate that. The needs that were addressed as a part of the prior study are very different than the needs that are being addressed as a part of this study. So the square footage is not the same. So we wanted to make sure that that police needs indeed could be addressed, courts needs could be addressed, the prosecutor needs could be addressed within the existing facilities. And I think that that's what Trivers has demonstrated. And the intention is for the next meeting to bring forward, how do we address the other needs of the organization that exist. Now, that's not to say that the mayor and council won't make a decision that we understand that we could fit all of this within the existing facilities, but we choose to do something different. We choose to do new construction. That's a decision that you as a body will end up needing to make. But what I'm saying is that before we can move forward into the design phase, they must know that decision has to be made, because it would seem unreasonable to design two facilities, one being a rehab of the existing facilities and the second one being new construction. So we wanted to show you how it all can work. We'll come back once the space needs project is completed and give you very rough estimates on if you want to renovate the existing facilities, here's roughly what your cost will be. If you want to construct a new facility, here's what your cost will be.
And I sort of hope, I'll let somebody ask a question, but I was sort of hoping that's where we were supposed to be now. And it seems like this is going to be forever continuous study of things. And so, okay, I'll let somebody answer a question before I say anything else. I'll pause for a second.
Thank you. And, it may seem to me that there's a loose pachyderm on the premises. Mr. Rose, why were we not presented with an option 3, which would be a completely new facility for the police, instead of trying to get the annex to modify this or that, take out some floors? They can have some storage, but then they'll have some storage somewhere else. Maybe they have to have a lobby. Will we be presented with an option that would give the police a new facility so that we don't have to try and make the annex work for them? Because it seems to me that from this wonderful report that we are trying to modify the police to be able to fit into this building, rather than finding out what the police needs are and modify a building or build a building for them according to what their needs are. And I'd also like to say that whatever we do, this is what we're going to be studying for 20 or 30 years. Having, again, all of us, most of us toured the annex, I don't know that I can see that that's going to survive another 20 or 30 years. And the amount of money that we may put in for renovation would be better spent on giving them a new facility that's more modernized.
Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Kusick, we can bring back to you whatever your choosing is. We initially wanted to simply indicate this is how it could fit within existing facilities. And you know, I was under the impression, because that was going to be the most challenging task, which is to identify the needs of the police department and fit those into the existing facility. That's where we started. Now, if you want to expand the scope of the project and say, okay, we understand that, but we want to see how a new structure would look, that's certainly within the purview of the mayor and council to do that. That was not our initial charge, though. Our initial charge was identify the space needs for the organization, which I think we've done. And then, at least for police, identify how that might fit within our existing facilities.
If I could have one follow-up question. So the original scope of the study was not to include an option for the police in their own facility.
I don't believe that, Honorable Mayor and Councilmember Kuzic, I don't believe that was part of the original scope, but I will defer to Sina.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. McMahon.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mayor. I think Sina was about to.
Oh, I'm sorry,
tell us
Sinan.
what the scope was.
I apologize, Sinan.
That's accurate, Mr. Rose. It's not in the scope. The scope was to look at the existing facilities and fit the current programs with their future projections within the existing facilities.
Well, that might have been the scope that Sinan was presented, but that's not the scope that I remember at all. I don't remember it being that specific at all.
Well, I am certain that if there's a concern about the scope, I'm assuming that Mr. Rose and Sinan can provide what the scope document was. But let's move forward on with Mr. McMahon.
Yeah, my concern, if we're not changing, but whatever the scope is, if we're now wanting to analyze new construction as part of a component of our space needs study, what you're really looking at then is looking at Trinity and the annex essentially being empty, and all the other things that we can do. What are we going to do with these empty buildings? I mean, I keep hearing about let's build new, but that's a really big study to say, well, then what are we going to do with all this extra square footage that we own? So that, if we don't want to keep studying and studying, that's opening up a big can of worms in my view, to say, to suddenly throw that in to this at this point, because that's always been, I think, one of the discussions. If we can't use the annex, and I think that's what the first go round was. In my mind, the first go round of these studies was, can we use it? And the second go round is, how do we use it if it can be used? And that's where we're at now. And then we have to have the policy decision. If we don't think the how we can use it fits with how we view our city moving forward, then you're going to move into new construction. But then you've got to open up this whole thing. Well, then what are we going to do with all this space we own, which is a real problem, I think, to look into. So that's really going to be a big nut to crack if we're going to be looking at that. That's just my thoughts on where we move next.
Yes, Mr. McMahon. Prior to Mr. Clay wanting a second bite of the apple, I would like to ask just a couple of questions, and that is that, can we talk a little bit about the Ferguson report and the pros and cons of either following the recommendation or not following the recommendation? And I'm not sure that question can be answered by anyone. And Mr. Smotherson, it would be great if you could either go on mute or get your phone to not do the text. Thank you.
Honorable Mayor, Amanda or Bob, are you familiar, or Chief Hampton, with the Ferguson report as it relates specifically to the separation of the police and courts and prosecuting office? Chief, can you speak to that?
I can. I'm familiar. I think Kathy Matthews is quite familiar as well. It's the separation of the, and it's not just in a physical sense, but it's in the theoretical sense, I guess, as far as the day-to-day affairs of the court and the police not being adjoined and having the same personnel handle duties of each department, meaning that you have facilities that were constructed prior to the Ferguson report, like just prior to the Ferguson report, whether that's Bridgeton, whether that's Berkeley, whether that's Maryland Heights, all. So they were allowed to have the setups that they went with and still to facilitate the separation of the police and the law enforcement duties along with the prosecutor and along with the courts themselves, the municipal court clerks and judges and what have you. So it's not just having separate facilities or wall space in between, it's having that separation of the day-to-day situation. So it's not, I don't want to say the word that you do not have to have that, but it's more of a sense of who is handling what, how is it being handled, and who is conferring with who.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to chime in on that answer? Or we?
Well, so basically the Ferguson report is just a suggestion. Is that correct?
No, Senate Bill 5 is not a suggestion. The Ferguson report is a DOJ recommendations from the consent decree, and it's also dealing with it's dealing with more than just the separations of the aspect. It was the profiting off the poverty. It was giving an example. University City is barely at 3% of fees and fines in court profit, as opposed to how some departments were much higher, over 20, 50, 40%. Which is why St. Anne is suing, because it takes away their revenue to hire more personnel, to keep personnel in stock. And basically, that's what it mainly focused on, is showing that the police department, the courts, the prosecutors are not in cahoots with each other in order to keep the facilitation of fines and fees coming in.
Honorable Mayor, if I could just say, the Ferguson report, the DOJ's report, was simply the first step towards criminal justice reform. And it was viewed that the relationship between police and the prosecution and the courts was simply too cozy. So they wanted to make changes to that, to the culture, so that a more fair process emerged. John, you probably are familiar with this as well. Anything to add? You are, Chief Hampton.
So there's the Ferguson report, which is not a law. It doesn't necessarily govern the court operations, but there is it's a Missouri Supreme Court rule. It's Rule 37. That was revised in the wake of Ferguson. And there is a minimum operating standard, which I think is relevant to our discussion. And that states that municipal divisions shall be operated in a manner that upholds the constitutional provisions of the separation of powers and the integrity of the judiciary as a separate and independent branch of government. Now, specifically with respect to facilities, it states that a municipal division's facilities exterior and interior signage, design, functionality, and other factors should convey an appearance to the public that is a separate and independent branch of government. So those are the guiding principles under the Missouri Supreme Court rule that governs the operation of the municipal divisions.
And my comment really is more about, particularly since we're having more and more issues with the public and the protests, civil unrest, and all quite justified. Doesn't it make sense to us that we would want to implement this change? And I'm just saying that more as just a discussion point for my colleagues and I as we move forward. But it would seem to me like in University City, we would want to implement those changes that probably make it more apparent that distinction and division is there. The other thing, I guess, what I would say too, and I'm not sure, probably this is to everybody participating, is when you are sitting in a community that is not growing in population, and you're now in the midst of a pandemic that is convincing more and more people to not take more space and to spend more time working at home, even though we have many functions that may not be able to work at home. I think we all have to pause as to whether or not we are going to, in fact, become a bigger developer or landlord and have more buildings than less, because I think we've kind of got to think about how this is maybe changing the environments in which we work. We are at 6:15 and everyone has had a chance to make questions and comments. I think Mr. Clay had some more comments or questions. So Mr. Clay.
Yeah. Just had a quick question. Thank you, Mayor. A couple of things. So I have no doubt of the plain language of the scope says what it says that the city manager and Director Alpasan are asserting. I think as a practical matter, it seems kind of like what's happened is we did the space needs study. The question was asked, can the police fit in the annex? Can they be housed there? I mean, I think the answer is yes, because they were, but is that really the right question to be asking? What do the police really need? And is it more configuring a space around their actual needs than saying, yes, this could conceivably hold them, they could fit in there? I think that's a little bit of a different question. The other thing is, the city manager alluded to the police being in this location for 15 or 20 years. I would say it's probably more like 40 or 50 years, because undoubtedly, even just to do the annex is going to be a multi-million dollar endeavor to get it to where it needs to be. So if we just amortize that, I can't see a council in 15 years revisiting anything significant with the police or facilities if we make these decisions. I know we're not at that point, but I just don't see that. So I see this as more of a kind of a 40-year decision as opposed to a 15-year one, given the resources that would be necessary to get the annex up to where it needs to be. So with that, I'll concede the floor.
Bales.
Thank you. I have two quick questions of the city manager. And then I have some additional comments. Where right now is both court support and the court clerk located?
Both of those are, Honorable Mayor and Councilmember Hales, both of those are located in the temporary facility that houses the police.
Okay, thank you. And I do agree with Councilmember Clay about the time frame we're looking at. I think if done, it needs to be done. I think this is a infrastructure-wise 40 to 50, perhaps more year plan for the annex, and for that matter, potentially the library as well. I do just want to jump back. I did expect more or less like what we got in this packet for the report, in terms of what do we have, how can we best use it with what we have. The last go round with the police, I recall we talked about the annex, and we talked about the potential cost of that and the potential cost of a new facility. But this is, when you look at the sort of shared space in the lobby, I had not thought about that. I think that's actually rather interesting. And then also in response to Councilmember Clay, I do agree that the police were there, but there was a huge amount of the building that the police didn't use. The fire engine bays were not functional space. They were storage space, I suppose. But we also all went through, or most of us, I think, went through the building, and the living quarters for the fire department. The chief can probably chime in and what capacity those were used by the police department, but what we're talking about with a wholesale potential, wholesale renovation of this building completely throws out what's there and completely redesigns the space from the inside. So yes, it's the same building, but we're certainly not talking about the same amount of space.
Lies, or we go on to Mr. Smotherson. Mr. Smotherson.
Just a quick statement. I mean, you know, to answer Councilmember McMahon's question about what do, we've never been shown that. And to me, that was the whole point originally of this study, was to show us what the possibilities were, and we've not been shown that. So again, maybe again, it's my mistake, but I don't remember that. And again, I've never, ever, I've always been expecting a study that shows us what those possibilities were, other than putting the police back into the annex. And I'll just leave it at that.
Mr. McMahon.
Yeah, so on the study, it looks like we're going from the temporary place for the police of 18,000 square feet to 34,000 square feet. So the question is, the 34,000 square feet that's proposed in this study, was it based upon input from the police department as to what their needs are? Was it based upon the information of policing and what they need to function, rather than taking what we did when the building was condemned and making the police fit into 18,000 square feet? So when we're taking them out of the temporary, are we meeting today's standards and with input from our police department as to what they need? Because if that's what we did, then we're not really just trying to jam them back into exactly what they had in the annex before. We're actually just taking a shell and giving them a modern facility. So that's my question. What went into the 34,000? How was that space determined in the needs of the police?
Honorable Mayor, Councilmember McMahon. Yes, we worked with police. Initially, it was Trevor's and Mr. Appleston that worked with Chief Hampton and his staff about what would an ideal, from just a space needs, what would an ideal police facility include? And so that's where it came up with the space that we have today. Now, I had a follow-up meeting with Chief Hampton because of the significant difference in the amount of space that was being requested, to really just confirm, you know, sometimes it's, I want this versus I need this. And I thought, you know, we'd have a discussion about what was needed. And I'm recommending I'm confirming, I guess, the space that Chief Hampton is requesting is indeed wanted and needed for his operations in the future. So it wasn't a situation where we were just saying, look, we're going to give you the identical amount of space that you had before. It was really from a blank sheet of paper. What's the space that you think is needed for effective operations? And that's what this provides.
We are at 6:23. We have a few minutes left. Are there additional questions or comments, either by council members, by our staff members, or by our friends from HOK and Trivers?
Honorable Mayor, I just want to add, the police definitely had input in what is needed to facilitate a 21st century policing tactic, i.e. Example, storage space of evidence, control rooms, decontamination bays. The police building, when we left the annex, we did not have showers and locker rooms. We did not have any of that facilitation. So this is stuff on a day-to-day basis that was inputted with Trivers, Bob Swartz, and HOK, and through the city manager's office, as well as through Sanan, that they got to meet with each department commander and supervisor as to what are the needs of your space over here. Like right now, we're making do in this temporary facility to facilitate what needs to be done. But we left a building that had approximately 3 evidence rooms, 1 smaller, 1 medium, 1 large, to now we have 1 evidence storage facility. By law, we have to hold on to certain evidence packages and items for quite a bit of time until the disposition of a case is completed. And that puts the burden on the law enforcement agency that has to do that. Along with, and we're not talking about holding facilities for prisoners and what so have you. It's a very minor space contingent.
Thank you. With that being said, I appreciate everyone for joining us for the study session, and we will adjourn and pick up in about 5 minutes for the regular meeting of the City Council. To Amanda and Bob, thank you very much for joining us, as well as Sinan, Kathy, and Chief Hampton. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.